The Battle of Santiago de Cuba, a pivotal clash in the Spanish-American War. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba, fought on July 3, 1898, was a decisive naval engagement during the Spanish-American War. This battle marked the culmination of a series of conflicts between Spain and the United States, primarily over the issue of Cuban independence. The battle took place in the waters off the coast of Santiago de Cuba, a port city on the southeastern coast of Cuba. It was here that the Spanish Caribbean Squadron, under the command of Admiral Pascual Cervera y Tapete, faced off against the United States Navy's North Atlantic Squadron, led by Rear Admiral William T. Sampson and Commodore Winfield Scott Schley. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba was not only a significant military confrontation but also a turning point in the Spanish-American War. The outcome of this battle had far-reaching consequences, leading to the eventual defeat of Spain and the emergence of the United States as a global power. This article will delve into the historical context, the key players, the strategies employed, the battle itself, and the aftermath of this pivotal event. Historical context: the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War, which lasted from April to August 1898, was a conflict between Spain and the United States. The war was primarily fought over the issue of Cuban independence, as Cuba was one of Spain's last remaining colonies in the Americas. The United States, which had long been interested in expanding its influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific, saw an opportunity to intervene in Cuba's struggle for independence. The war was sparked by several factors, including the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, which killed 266 American sailors. Although the cause of the explosion was never definitively determined, the incident was widely attributed to Spanish sabotage, and it galvanized public opinion in the United States in favor of war. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. The Cuban struggle for independence. Cuba had been a Spanish colony since the early 16th century, but by the late 19th century, the island was in a state of turmoil. The Cuban people had been fighting for independence from Spain for decades, and by the 1890s, the struggle had escalated into a full-scale war. The Cuban rebels, led by figures such as José Martí and Máximo Gómez, were determined to achieve independence, but they faced a formidable opponent in the Spanish military. The United States had long been sympathetic to the Cuban cause, and American newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, played a significant role in shaping public opinion in favor of Cuban independence. The sensationalist reporting of the Cuban conflict, often referred to as yellow journalism, helped to build support for American intervention in Cuba. The Spanish Caribbean Squadron. In response to the growing threat of American intervention, Spain dispatched a naval squadron to the Caribbean under the command of Admiral Pascual Cervera y Tapete. The squadron, known as the Spanish Caribbean Squadron, consisted of 4 armored cruisers, the Infanta Maria Teresa, the Vizcaya, the Cristobal Colón, and the Almirante Oquendo. The squadron also included 2 destroyers, the Führer and the Pluton. Admiral Cervera was a seasoned naval officer with extensive experience, but he was well aware of the challenges he faced. The Spanish fleet was outmatched by the United States Navy in terms of both numbers and firepower. Moreover, the Spanish ships were in poor condition, with outdated equipment and insufficient supplies. Despite these disadvantages, Cervera was determined to carry out his orders and defend Spanish interests in the Caribbean. The United States Navy's North Atlantic Squadron. The United States Navy's North Atlantic Squadron, under the command of Rear Admiral William T. Sampson, was tasked with blockading the Spanish fleet in Santiago de Cuba. The squadron consisted of a formidable force of battleships, cruisers, and other vessels, including the USS Iowa, the USS Indiana, the USS Oregon, and the USS Texas. Commodore Winfield Scott Schley, who commanded the flying squadron, also played a key role in the blockade. The United States Navy was well prepared for the conflict, with modern ships and well-trained crews. The American strategy was to prevent the Spanish fleet from leaving Santiago de Cuba and to force a decisive engagement that would result in the destruction of the Spanish squadron. The blockade of Santiago de Cuba. The arrival of the Spanish fleet. Admiral Cervera's squadron arrived in Santiago de Cuba on May 19, 1898, after a long and arduous journey from Spain. The Spanish ships were in poor condition, and the crews were exhausted. Cervera was aware that his fleet was no match for the American Navy, and he believed that the best course of action was to avoid a direct confrontation. However, he was under orders to defend Santiago de Cuba and to support the Spanish forces on the island. The arrival of the Spanish fleet in Santiago de Cuba was a significant development in the war. The United States Navy quickly established a blockade of the port, preventing the Spanish ships from leaving. The blockade was a key part of the American strategy, as it aimed to cut off the Spanish fleet from the rest of the world and to force a decisive engagement. The American blockade of Santiago de Cuba was a formidable operation. The North Atlantic Squadron, under the command of Rear Admiral Sampson, established a tight perimeter around the port, with ships patrolling the entrance to the harbor and maintaining a constant watch on the Spanish fleet. The blockade was designed to prevent the Spanish ships from escaping and to force them to either surrender or engage in battle. The blockade was not without its challenges. The American ships had to contend with the difficult conditions of the Caribbean, including intense heat, storms, and the threat of disease. Moreover, the Spanish fleet was well protected by the fortifications around Santiago de Cuba, which made it difficult for the American ships to approach the harbor. Despite these challenges, the American blockade was largely successful. The Spanish fleet was effectively trapped in Santiago de Cuba, and the American ships were able to maintain a constant presence outside the harbor. The blockade put significant pressure on the Spanish forces, both at sea and on land, and it set the stage for the eventual battle. The decision to break the blockade by early July 1898, the situation in Santiago de Cuba had become increasingly dire for the Spanish forces. The American blockade had cut off supplies and reinforcements, and the Spanish fleet was running low on fuel and ammunition. Admiral Cervera was faced with a difficult decision: either remain in Santiago de Cuba and risk being captured or attempt to break the blockade and escape to open sea. Cervera was well aware of the risks involved in attempting to break the blockade. The American fleet was superior in both numbers and firepower, and the Spanish ships were in poor condition. However, Cervera believed that the only hope for the Spanish fleet was to make a run for it and try to escape to the open sea. He hoped that by breaking the blockade, he could at least save some of his ships and avoid a complete disaster. On the morning of July 3, 1898, Cervera made the decision to attempt to break the blockade. The Spanish fleet prepared to leave Santiago de Cuba and make a run for the open sea. The stage was set for the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The Spanish fleet's breakout at around 9:30 a.m. on July 3, 1898. The Spanish fleet began its attempt to break the American blockade. The Infanta Maria Teresa, Cervera's flagship, led the way, followed by the Vizcaya, the Cristobal Colon, and the Almirante Oquendo. The two destroyers, the Führer and the Pluton, brought up the rear. The Spanish ships were at a significant disadvantage from the start. The American fleet was well prepared and had been anticipating a breakout attempt. The American ships were positioned to intercept the Spanish fleet as it left the harbor, and they were ready to engage in battle. As the Spanish ships emerged from the harbor, they were immediately met with a hail of gunfire from the American fleet. The American ships, including the USS Iowa, the USS Indiana, the USS Oregon, and the USS Texas, opened fire on the Spanish fleet with their heavy guns. The Spanish ships, already in poor condition, were quickly overwhelmed by the superior firepower of the American fleet. The destruction of the Spanish fleet. The battle was a one-sided affair, with the American fleet dominating the engagement. The Spanish ships were unable to effectively return fire, and they were quickly crippled by the American gunfire. The Infanta Maria Teresa, Cervera's flagship, was the first to be hit. The ship was struck by several shells, which caused significant damage and started fires on board. Despite the damage, Cervera continued to lead his fleet, but it was clear that the Spanish ships were no match for the American fleet. The Vizcaya and the Almirante Oquendo were also quickly crippled by the American gunfire. Both ships were hit multiple times, and they were soon engulfed in flames. The crews of the Spanish ships fought bravely, but they were unable to withstand the relentless assault from the American fleet. The Cristobal Colon, the fastest and most modern of the Spanish ships, managed to escape the initial onslaught and made a run for the open sea. However, the ship was pursued by the USS Oregon, which was one of the fastest and most powerful ships in the American fleet. The Cristobal Colon was eventually forced to surrender after being cornered by the USS Oregon and other American ships. The two Spanish destroyers, the Führer and the Pluton, were also quickly overwhelmed by the American fleet. Both ships were hit by multiple shells and were soon sinking. The crews of the destroyers were forced to abandon ship, and both vessels were eventually destroyed. The aftermath of the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was a decisive victory for the United States Navy. The Spanish fleet was completely destroyed, with all of its ships either sunk or captured. The American fleet suffered minimal casualties, with only one sailor killed and a handful wounded. The Spanish fleet, on the other hand, suffered heavy casualties, with hundreds of sailors killed or wounded. The destruction of the Spanish fleet had a significant impact on the course of the war. With the Spanish fleet out of action, the United States was able to maintain control of the seas and to continue its operations in Cuba and other Spanish colonies. The victory at Santiago de Cuba also had a major psychological impact, boosting American morale and demoralizing the Spanish forces. Admiral Cervera and the surviving members of his crew were taken prisoner by the American forces. Cervera was treated with respect by the Americans, and he was eventually released and returned to Spain. Despite the defeat, Cervera was widely praised for his bravery and leadership during the battle. The aftermath of the battle, the impact on the Spanish-American War. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba was a turning point in the Spanish-American War. The destruction of the Spanish fleet effectively ended Spain's ability to continue the war at sea. With the Spanish fleet out of action, the United States was able to maintain control of the seas and to continue its operations in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The victory at Santiago de Cuba also had a significant impact on the land campaign in Cuba. With the Spanish fleet destroyed, the American forces were able to focus their efforts on the ground campaign, which ultimately led to the capture of Santiago de Cuba and the surrender of the Spanish forces on the island. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba also had a major impact on the international stage. The victory demonstrated the growing power of the United States as a global military force, and it marked the beginning of the end of Spain's colonial empire. The United States emerged from the war as a major world power, with new territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The Treaty of Paris. The Spanish-American War officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898. The treaty marked the end of Spain's colonial empire and the beginning of the United States' emergence as a global power. Under the terms of the treaty, Spain ceded control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The Treaty of Paris had far-reaching consequences for both Spain and the United States. For Spain, the treaty marked the end of its status as a colonial power and the beginning of a period of decline. For the United States, the treaty marked the beginning of its emergence as a global power, with new territories and responsibilities in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The legacy of the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba is remembered as one of the most significant naval battles in American history. The battle marked the end of Spain's colonial empire and the beginning of the United States' emergence as a global power. The victory at Santiago de Cuba demonstrated the growing strength of the United States Navy and its ability to project power on the global stage. The battle also had a significant impact on the development of naval warfare. The use of modern battleships and the emphasis on firepower and speed in the battle marked a shift in naval tactics and strategy. The lessons learned from the Battle of Santiago de Cuba would influence the development of naval warfare in the 20th century. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba is also remembered for the bravery and leadership of the men who fought in the battle. Admiral Cervera and his crew fought bravely against overwhelming odds, and their courage and determination are remembered to this day. The battle is a testament to the sacrifices made by the men who fought in the Spanish-American War, and it serves as a reminder of the importance of naval power in shaping the course of history. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba was a pivotal event in the Spanish-American War and in the history of the United States Navy. The battle marked the end of Spain's colonial empire and the beginning of the United States' emergence as a global power. The victory at Santiago de Cuba demonstrated the growing strength of the United States Navy and its ability to project power on the global stage. The battle also had a significant impact on the development of naval warfare, with the use of modern battleships and the emphasis on firepower and speed marking a shift in naval tactics and strategy. The lessons learned from the Battle of Santiago de Cuba would influence the development of naval warfare in the 20th century. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba is remembered as one of the most significant naval battles in American history, and it serves as a testament to the bravery and leadership of the men who fought in the battle. The battle is a reminder of the importance of naval power in shaping the course of history, and it continues to be studied and remembered as a key moment in the history of the United States Navy. The key strategic decisions that led to the American victory in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Introduction. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba, fought on July 3, 1898, was a pivotal naval engagement during the Spanish-American War. This battle marked the culmination of a series of strategic decisions and military operations that ultimately led to the decisive American victory. The defeat of the Spanish fleet not only secured American dominance in the Caribbean but also significantly contributed to the end of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas. This article delves into the key strategic decisions that underpinned the American triumph, examining the political, military, and logistical factors that shaped the outcome of the battle. Historical context. The Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War, which lasted from April to August 1898, was a conflict between the United States and Spain that arose primarily from American support for Cuban independence. The war was characterized by a series of naval and land battles in the Caribbean and the Pacific, with the Battle of Santiago de Cuba being one of the most significant engagements. The Cuban struggle for independence. Cuba had been a Spanish colony for centuries, but by the late 19th century, the island was embroiled in a struggle for independence. The Cuban War of Independence, which began in 1895, saw Cuban insurgents fighting against Spanish colonial forces. The conflict attracted significant attention in the United States, where public opinion was increasingly sympathetic to the Cuban cause. The role of the United States. The United States had long been interested in Cuba, both for its strategic location and its economic potential. The sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, which was blamed on Spain, provided the catalyst for American intervention. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain, and the conflict quickly expanded to include operations in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The strategic importance of Santiago de Cuba. Geographic significance. Santiago de Cuba, located on the southeastern coast of Cuba, was a strategically important port city. It served as a key naval base for the Spanish fleet and was a vital link in Spain's supply lines to its colonies in the Caribbean. Control of Santiago de Cuba would not only disrupt Spanish operations but also provide the United States with a strategic foothold in the region. The Spanish fleet at Santiago de Cuba. The Spanish fleet, under the command of Admiral Pascual Cervera, had taken refuge in Santiago de Cuba after a series of engagements with the American Navy. The fleet consisted of 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers, which were outgunned and outmatched by the American forces. However, the Spanish fleet's presence in Santiago de Cuba posed a significant threat to American operations in the Caribbean, and its destruction was a key objective for the United States. Key strategic decisions leading to the American victory. The decision to establish a naval blockade. The blockade strategy. One of the most critical strategic decisions made by the United States was to establish a naval blockade around Santiago de Cuba. The blockade, which began in late May 1898, was designed to cut off the Spanish fleet from resupply and reinforcement, effectively trapping them in the harbor. The blockade was enforced by a squadron of American warships under the command of Rear Admiral William T. Sampson. Impact of the blockade. The blockade had a profound impact on the Spanish fleet. It prevented the Spanish ships from receiving essential supplies, including coal, ammunition, and food, which severely limited their ability to operate effectively. The blockade also forced the Spanish fleet to remain in port, where they were vulnerable to attack. The decision to establish a blockade was a key factor in the eventual destruction of the Spanish fleet. The decision to launch a land campaign. The landing at Daiquiri and Siboney. In addition to the naval blockade, the United States also decided to launch a land campaign to support the naval operations. On June 22, 1898, American forces, under the command of Major General William R. Shafter, landed at Daiquiri and Siboney, east of Santiago de Cuba. The landing was supported by naval gunfire from the American fleet, which helped to suppress Spanish defenses. The advance on Santiago de Cuba. The American forces quickly advanced towards Santiago de Cuba, engaging in a series of battles with Spanish troops along the way. The most significant of these battles was the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898, where American forces, including the famous Rough Riders led by Theodore Roosevelt, achieved a decisive victory. The success of the land campaign put additional pressure on the Spanish fleet, which was now facing the prospect of being trapped between the American Navy and Army. The decision to attack the Spanish fleet. The plan of attack. As the land campaign progressed, it became clear that the Spanish fleet would attempt to break out of Santiago de Cuba to avoid capture. The American command, recognizing the opportunity to destroy the Spanish fleet, decided to prepare for a naval engagement. Rear Admiral Sampson and Commodore Winfield Scott Schley, who commanded the American fleet, developed a plan to intercept and destroy the Spanish ships as they attempted to escape. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba on July 3, 1898, the Spanish fleet, under the command of Admiral Cervera, attempted to break out of Santiago de Cuba. The American fleet, which had been waiting for this moment, quickly engaged the Spanish ships. The battle was a one-sided affair, with the American ships, including the battleships USS Indiana, USS Oregon, and USS Iowa, delivering devastating firepower. Within hours, the entire Spanish fleet was destroyed, with all 6 ships either sunk or run aground. The decision to utilize superior naval technology. The role of the American battleships. One of the key factors in the American victory was the superior technology and firepower of the American battleships. The United States had invested heavily in modernizing its navy in the years leading up to the war, and this investment paid off in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The American battleships were faster, more heavily armed, and better armored than their Spanish counterparts, giving them a significant advantage in the engagement. The impact of naval gunfire. The American battleships' superior firepower allowed them to deliver accurate and devastating gunfire on the Spanish ships. The Spanish fleet, which was already weakened by the blockade and the land campaign, was unable to withstand the onslaught. The decision to utilize superior naval technology was a critical factor in the American victory. The decision to coordinate naval and land operations. The importance of coordination. Another key strategic decision was the coordination of naval and land operations. The American command recognized that the success of the naval blockade and the land campaign were interdependent. The blockade prevented the Spanish fleet from escaping, while the land campaign put additional pressure on the Spanish forces in Santiago de Cuba. The coordination of these operations was essential to the overall success of the American strategy. The role of communication. Effective communication between the naval and land forces was crucial to the coordination of operations. The American command established a system of communication that allowed for the rapid exchange of information between the fleet and the Army. This system enabled the American forces to respond quickly to changes in the situation and to coordinate their efforts effectively. The decision to exploit Spanish weaknesses. Spanish logistical challenges. The Spanish fleet faced significant logistical challenges, including a lack of coal and ammunition, which severely limited their ability to operate effectively. The American command recognized these weaknesses and exploited them through the blockade and the land campaign. By cutting off the Spanish fleet from resupply and reinforcement, the Americans were able to weaken the Spanish forces and set the stage for the decisive naval engagement. Spanish command and control issues. The Spanish command also faced challenges in terms of coordination and control. Admiral Cervera was aware of the weaknesses of his fleet and the challenges posed by the American blockade, but he was under pressure from the Spanish government to take action. The decision to attempt a breakout from Santiago de Cuba was a desperate move that ultimately led to the destruction of the Spanish fleet. The American command recognized the Spanish command and control issues and exploited them to their advantage. The decision to maintain strategic patience. The importance of patience. The American command demonstrated strategic patience in the lead-up to the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Rather than rushing into a premature engagement, the Americans took the time to establish the blockade, launch the land campaign, and prepare for the eventual naval battle. This patience allowed the Americans to build up their forces, gather intelligence, and develop a comprehensive strategy that ultimately led to victory. The role of intelligence. Intelligence played a crucial role in the American strategy. The American command gathered information on the Spanish fleet's movements, strengths, and weaknesses, which allowed them to make informed decisions. The decision to maintain strategic patience was based on a thorough understanding of the situation and a recognition that the Spanish fleet would eventually be forced to make a move. The decision to leverage public and political support. Public opinion and the war effort. Public opinion in the United States was strongly in favor of the war, and the American command recognized the importance of leveraging this support. The decision to launch a high-profile campaign in Cuba, including the landing at Daiquiri and Siboney and the advance on Santiago de Cuba, was designed to rally public support and demonstrate the effectiveness of the American military. Political support and strategic decision-making. Political support was also crucial to the American strategy. The American command worked closely with political leaders to ensure that the war effort had the necessary resources and support. The decision to invest in modernizing the Navy, establish the blockade, and launch the land campaign was made with the backing of the political leadership, which was essential to the success of the American strategy. The decision to focus on the Caribbean theater. The strategic importance of the Caribbean. The American command recognized the strategic importance of the Caribbean theater and focused their efforts on securing control of the region. The decision to prioritize the Caribbean over other potential theaters of operation, such as the Philippines, was based on a recognition of the region's strategic significance and the need to eliminate the Spanish threat in the Western Hemisphere. The impact on the war effort. The focus on the Caribbean theater allowed the Americans to concentrate their forces and resources on a single objective, which was essential to the success of the campaign. The decision to prioritize the Caribbean was a key factor in the American victory at Santiago de Cuba and the overall success of the war effort. The decision to exploit the element of surprise. The role of surprise in the naval engagement. The American command recognized the importance of surprise in the naval engagement and took steps to ensure that the Spanish fleet would be caught off guard. The decision to maintain the blockade and wait for the Spanish fleet to attempt a breakout was based on a recognition that the element of surprise would be crucial to the success of the engagement. The impact of surprise on the outcome. The element of surprise played a significant role in the outcome of the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The Spanish fleet, which was already weakened and demoralized, was caught off guard by the rapid and devastating attack from the American fleet. The decision to exploit the element of surprise was a key factor in the American victory. The American victory in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was the result of a series of key strategic decisions that were made in the lead-up to and during the engagement. The decision to establish a naval blockade, launch a land campaign, attack the Spanish fleet, utilize superior naval technology, coordinate naval and land operations, exploit Spanish weaknesses, maintain strategic patience, leverage public and political support, focus on the Caribbean theater, and exploit the element of surprise were all critical to the outcome of the battle. These decisions were based on a thorough understanding of the strategic situation, a recognition of the strengths and weaknesses of both the American and Spanish forces, and a commitment to achieving a decisive victory. The success of the American strategy at Santiago de Cuba not only secured American dominance in the Caribbean but also marked a turning point in the Spanish-American War, leading to the eventual defeat of Spain and the end of its colonial empire in the Americas. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba stands as a testament to the importance of strategic decision-making in military operations. The American victory was not the result of chance or luck, but rather the product of careful planning, effective coordination, and the execution of a well-conceived strategy. The lessons learned from this battle continue to resonate in the study of military history and the art of warfare. The impact of the destruction of the Spanish fleet on the outcome of the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War, fought between April and August 1898, was a pivotal conflict that marked the emergence of the United States as a global power. The war was primarily fought over the issues of Cuban independence and American interests in the Caribbean and the Pacific. One of the most significant aspects of the war was the destruction of the Spanish fleet, which had a profound impact on the outcome of the conflict. This article will explore in detail how the destruction of the Spanish fleet influenced the course and conclusion of the Spanish-American War. Background of the Spanish-American War. Causes of the war. The Spanish-American War was the culmination of years of tension between Spain and the United States. The primary cause of the war was the desire of the Cuban people for independence from Spanish colonial rule. The Cuban struggle for independence had been ongoing for decades, and by the 1890s, the conflict had escalated into a full-scale war. The United States, which had significant economic interests in Cuba, was increasingly sympathetic to the Cuban cause. The situation was further exacerbated by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. Although the cause of the explosion was never definitively determined, the American press, particularly the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, blamed Spain and called for war. The slogan "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became a rallying cry for Americans who supported intervention in Cuba. The role of naval power played a crucial role in the Spanish-American War. Both Spain and the United States recognized the importance of controlling the seas, particularly in the Caribbean and the Pacific, where the key battles of the war would be fought. The United States had been building up its navy in the years leading up to the war, inspired by the theories of naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued that control of the seas was essential for national power. Spain, on the other hand, had a once mighty navy that had been in decline for decades. The Spanish fleet was outdated and poorly maintained, and Spain was ill-prepared for a naval conflict with the United States. Nevertheless, Spain still had a significant naval presence in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, and the outcome of the war would largely depend on which side could achieve naval supremacy. The destruction of the Spanish fleet. The Battle of Manila Bay, the first major naval engagement of the Spanish-American War, took place in the Philippines, far from the main theater of conflict in the Caribbean. On May 1, 1898, the U.S. Asiatic Squadron, commanded by Commodore George Dewey, engaged the Spanish Pacific Squadron under Admiral Patricio Montojo in Manila Bay. The battle was a decisive victory for the United States. Dewey's squadron, which consisted of modern, well-armed ships, quickly overwhelmed the outdated and poorly maintained Spanish fleet. The Spanish ships were either sunk or captured, and the U.S. Navy gained control of Manila Bay. The victory at Manila Bay was a significant blow to Spanish morale and demonstrated the superiority of the U.S. Navy. The destruction of the Spanish Pacific Squadron had several important consequences. First, it effectively ended Spanish naval power in the Pacific, allowing the United States to establish a foothold in the Philippines. Second, it boosted American morale and demonstrated the effectiveness of the U.S. Navy, which had been built up in the years leading up to the war. Finally, it set the stage for the eventual U.S. annexation of the Philippines, which would become a key American colony in the Pacific. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba, the most significant naval engagement of the Spanish-American War, took place in the Caribbean, off the coast of Cuba. The Spanish Atlantic Fleet, commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera, had taken refuge in the harbor of Santiago de Cuba, where it was blockaded by the U.S. Navy under the command of Admiral William T. Sampson and Commodore Winfield Scott Schley. On July 3, 1898, Cervera attempted to break out of the harbor and escape the blockade. The resulting Battle of Santiago de Cuba was a disaster for the Spanish fleet. The U.S. Navy, with its superior ships and firepower, quickly overwhelmed the Spanish ships, which were either sunk or forced to run aground. The entire Spanish fleet was destroyed, and Cervera and his crew were captured. The destruction of the Spanish Atlantic Fleet was a turning point in the war. With the loss of its navy, Spain was unable to reinforce or resupply its forces in Cuba, and the island was effectively cut off from Spain. The U.S. Navy's control of the seas also allowed American forces to land in Cuba and Puerto Rico, where they would go on to achieve decisive victories on land. The role of naval blockades. In addition to the major naval battles, the U.S. Navy also imposed a strict blockade on Cuba and Puerto Rico, which further weakened the Spanish position. The blockade prevented Spain from resupplying its forces in the Caribbean and cut off communication between Spain and its colonies. The blockade also had a significant impact on the Cuban population, which was already suffering from the effects of the war and the Spanish policy of reconcentration. The naval blockade was a key factor in the eventual Spanish defeat. Without the ability to resupply or reinforce its forces, Spain was unable to sustain its war effort in the Caribbean. The blockade also demonstrated the effectiveness of the U.S. Navy and its ability to project power far from American shores. The impact of the destruction of the Spanish fleet on the outcome of the war. Strategic implications. The destruction of the Spanish fleet had several strategic implications that directly influenced the outcome of the war. First, it gave the United States control of the seas, which was essential for the success of American military operations in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. With the Spanish fleet out of the way, the U.S. Navy was able to transport troops, supplies, and equipment to the front lines without interference. Second, the destruction of the Spanish fleet effectively cut off Spain from its colonies. Without a navy, Spain was unable to reinforce or resupply its forces in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. This left the Spanish garrisons in these colonies isolated and vulnerable to American attacks. Finally, the destruction of the Spanish fleet had a significant impact on Spanish morale. The loss of the navy was a devastating blow to Spain's national pride and demonstrated the futility of continuing the war. The Spanish government, recognizing that it could no longer defend its colonies, was forced to sue for peace. The role of naval power in American strategy. The destruction of the Spanish fleet also highlighted the importance of naval power in American military strategy. The U.S. Navy's decisive victories at Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba demonstrated the effectiveness of a modern, well-equipped Navy in achieving strategic objectives. The success of the U.S. Navy in the Spanish-American War helped to solidify the United States' position as a global power and set the stage for the continued expansion of American naval power in the 20th century. The war also validated the theories of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who had argued that control of the seas was essential for national power. Mahan's ideas had influenced the buildup of the U.S. Navy in the years leading up to the war, and the success of the Navy in the Spanish-American War helped to cement Mahan's reputation as one of the most influential naval strategists of his time. The Treaty of Paris and the end of the war. The destruction of the Spanish fleet was a key factor in the negotiations that led to the end of the war. With its navy destroyed and its colonies cut off, Spain was in no position to continue the fight. On August 12, 1898, Spain and the United States signed an armistice, and on December 10, 1898, the two countries signed the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war. Under the terms of the treaty, Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States and granted Cuba its independence. The treaty marked the end of the Spanish Empire in the Americas and the Pacific and established the United States as a colonial power in its own right. The destruction of the Spanish fleet played a crucial role in the negotiations. With its navy destroyed, Spain had no leverage in the negotiations and was forced to accept the terms dictated by the United States. The loss of the navy also made it clear to Spain that it could no longer defend its overseas colonies, and the Spanish government was willing to give them up in exchange for peace. The long-term consequences of the war. The destruction of the Spanish fleet and the outcome of the Spanish-American War had long-term consequences for both Spain and the United States. For Spain, the loss of its navy and its colonies marked the end of its status as a global power. The war was a humiliating defeat for Spain, and it led to a period of national introspection and political instability. For the United States, the war marked the beginning of its emergence as a global power. The victory over Spain and the acquisition of overseas colonies demonstrated that the United States was capable of projecting power beyond its borders. The war also set the stage for the continued expansion of American influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and it established the United States as a major player on the world stage. The destruction of the Spanish fleet also had implications for the future of naval warfare. The success of the U.S. Navy in the Spanish-American War demonstrated the importance of having a modern, well-equipped navy in achieving strategic objectives. The war helped to spur further investment in naval technology and the expansion of the U.S. Navy, which would play a crucial role in World War I and World War II. The destruction of the Spanish fleet was a decisive factor in the outcome of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. Navy's victories at Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba gave the United States control of the seas and cut off Spain from its colonies. The loss of the Navy was a devastating blow to Spanish morale and forced Spain to sue for peace. The destruction of the Spanish fleet also highlighted the importance of naval power in American military strategy and set the stage for the continued expansion of American influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The Spanish-American War marked the end of the Spanish Empire and the beginning of the United States' emergence as a global power. The destruction of the Spanish fleet was a key factor in this transformation, and it had long-term consequences for both Spain and the United States. The war demonstrated the importance of naval power in achieving strategic objectives and helped to establish the United States as a major player on the world stage. In conclusion, the destruction of the Spanish fleet was a pivotal event in the Spanish-American War that had a profound impact on the outcome of the conflict. The loss of the Navy was a decisive factor in Spain's defeat and the United States' victory, and it set the stage for the continued expansion of American power in the 20th century. The Spanish-American War was a turning point in the history of both Spain and the United States, and the destruction of the Spanish fleet was a key moment in that transformation. The role of Cuban rebels in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba, fought on July 3, 1898, was a pivotal engagement in the Spanish-American War. It marked the culmination of a series of naval and land battles that ultimately led to the defeat of Spanish forces in Cuba and the end of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas. While the battle is often remembered for the decisive naval engagement between the United States Navy and the Spanish fleet, the role of Cuban rebels in the broader conflict cannot be overstated. The Cuban rebels, who had been fighting for independence from Spain for years before the arrival of American forces, played a crucial role in setting the stage for the Battle of Santiago de Cuba and in supporting the American military effort. This article will explore the multifaceted role of the Cuban rebels in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, examining their contributions to the land and naval campaigns, their impact on Spanish morale and logistics, and their broader significance in the struggle for Cuban independence. Historical context: the Cuban War of Independence. To understand the role of the Cuban rebels in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, it is essential to first examine the broader context of the Cuban War of Independence. 1895 to 1898, this conflict, also known as the Cuban Revolution, was the culmination of decades of discontent among Cubans under Spanish colonial rule. The Cuban people had long suffered under oppressive Spanish policies, including heavy taxation, lack of political representation, and economic exploitation. These grievances led to a series of uprisings and rebellions throughout the 19th century, culminating in the full-scale war for independence that began in 1895. The Cuban rebels, known as the Mambises, were a diverse group of fighters that included peasants, former slaves, and middle-class intellectuals. They were led by prominent figures such as Máximo Gómez, Antonio Maceo, and José Martí, who sought to unite Cubans across racial and class lines in the struggle for independence. The Mambises employed guerrilla warfare tactics, which allowed them to effectively harass Spanish forces and control large portions of the Cuban countryside. By the time the United States entered the conflict in 1898, the Cuban rebels had already significantly weakened Spanish control over the island. The Cuban rebels and the land campaign. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba was not just a naval engagement, it was part of a larger campaign that included significant land battles. The Cuban rebels played a critical role in these land operations, which were essential to the eventual American victory. Support for the American landing at Daiquiri and Siboney. When the United States decided to intervene in Cuba in 1898, one of the first challenges was to establish a secure beachhead for American troops. The Cuban rebels were instrumental in facilitating the American landings at Daiquiri and Siboney, two key locations near Santiago de Cuba. The rebels provided crucial intelligence about Spanish defenses, guided American forces through difficult terrain, and even engaged Spanish troops to divert their attention away from the landing sites. The rebels' knowledge of the local geography was particularly valuable. They helped American troops navigate the dense jungles and rugged hills surrounding Santiago de Cuba, which were unfamiliar to the U.S. military. This assistance allowed the Americans to establish a foothold on the island and begin their advance towards Santiago de Cuba. The siege of Santiago. Once American forces had landed, the Cuban rebels played a key role in the siege of Santiago de Cuba. The city was heavily fortified, and Spanish forces were determined to hold it at all costs. The rebels, however, had been waging a guerrilla war in the region for years and had already weakened Spanish control over the surrounding countryside. The rebels cut off Spanish supply lines, harassed Spanish troops, and prevented reinforcements from reaching the city. They also provided valuable intelligence to American commanders, including information about Spanish troop movements and the location of key fortifications. This intelligence was crucial in planning the American assault on the city. In addition to their military contributions, the Cuban rebels also played a psychological role in the siege. Their constant harassment of Spanish forces undermined morale and created a sense of insecurity among Spanish troops. The rebels' presence reminded the Spanish that they were not just fighting a foreign invader but also a determined and resilient local population that was fighting for its freedom. The Battle of San Juan Hill. One of the most famous land battles of the Santiago campaign was the Battle of San Juan Hill, which took place on July 1, 1898. This battle, which involved a daring uphill charge by American troops, is often remembered as a defining moment in the Spanish-American War. However, the Cuban rebels played a significant, though often overlooked, role in this engagement. The rebels had been active in the area around San Juan Hill for months before the battle, conducting raids and gathering intelligence. They provided American forces with detailed information about Spanish defenses on the hill, including the location of trenches, artillery positions, and machine gun nests. This intelligence was crucial in planning the American assault. During the battle itself, the Cuban rebels supported American troops by engaging Spanish forces on the flanks and rear, diverting their attention and preventing them from reinforcing their positions on the hill. The rebels' actions helped to create the conditions for the successful American charge, which ultimately led to the capture of San Juan Hill. The Cuban rebels and the naval campaign. While the Cuban rebels were primarily a land-based force, they also played a role in the naval campaign that culminated in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Their contributions to the naval effort were less direct than their land operations, but they were nonetheless significant, disrupting Spanish supply lines. One of the key factors that led to the Spanish fleet's decision to attempt a breakout from Santiago de Cuba was the deteriorating supply situation. The Cuban rebels had been actively disrupting Spanish supply lines for years, and their efforts intensified as the American blockade tightened. The rebels attacked Spanish convoys, destroyed bridges and railroads, and cut telegraph lines, making it increasingly difficult for the Spanish to resupply their forces in Santiago de Cuba. The rebels' actions not only weakened the Spanish fleet's ability to sustain itself but also contributed to the overall sense of isolation and desperation among Spanish forces. By the time the Spanish fleet attempted to break out of Santiago de Cuba on July 3, 1898, it was already in a precarious position due in part to the rebels' efforts, providing intelligence to the U.S. Navy. The Cuban rebels also provided valuable intelligence to the U.S. Navy, which was blockading the port of Santiago de Cuba. The rebels had a network of informants and scouts who monitored Spanish naval movements and reported back to American commanders. This intelligence was crucial in maintaining the effectiveness of the blockade and in planning the eventual destruction of the Spanish fleet. The rebels' knowledge of the local coastline and harbors was particularly valuable. They helped the U.S. Navy identify the best locations for blockading ships and provided information about potential escape routes that the Spanish fleet might use. This intelligence allowed the U.S. Navy to position its ships in a way that maximized their effectiveness and minimized the chances of a Spanish breakout. Supporting the blockade. In addition to providing intelligence, the Cuban rebels also took direct action to support the U.S. Navy's blockade of Santiago de Cuba. They conducted raids on Spanish coastal defenses, destroyed small boats that the Spanish might use to resupply their fleet, and even attempted to sabotage Spanish ships in the harbor. The rebels' actions not only weakened the Spanish fleet's ability to resist the blockade but also demonstrated their commitment to the broader struggle for Cuban independence. By actively supporting the U.S. Navy, the rebels showed that they were willing to work alongside American forces to achieve their common goal of defeating Spanish colonial rule. The impact of the Cuban rebels on Spanish morale and logistics. The Cuban rebels' contributions to the Battle of Santiago de Cuba extended beyond their direct military actions. Their persistent guerrilla warfare and sabotage efforts had a profound impact on Spanish morale and logistics, which in turn influenced the outcome of the battle. Undermining Spanish morale. The Cuban rebels' constant harassment of Spanish forces took a heavy toll on Spanish morale. The rebels' ability to strike at will, often with little warning, created a sense of insecurity and fear among Spanish troops. This was particularly true in the countryside, where Spanish forces were often isolated and vulnerable to rebel attacks. The psychological impact of the rebels' actions was compounded by the fact that they were fighting on their home turf. The rebels knew the land intimately and were able to use it to their advantage, ambushing Spanish patrols, setting traps, and disappearing into the jungle before Spanish forces could respond. This created a sense of helplessness among Spanish troops, who often felt that they were fighting an invisible enemy. By the time of the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, Spanish morale was already low due to years of fighting and the deteriorating supply situation. The rebels' actions further eroded Spanish morale, making it more difficult for Spanish commanders to maintain discipline and cohesion among their troops, disrupting Spanish logistics. The Cuban rebels' sabotage efforts also had a significant impact on Spanish logistics. The rebels targeted key infrastructure, such as railroads, bridges, and telegraph lines, which were essential for moving troops and supplies. They also attacked Spanish convoys, destroying or capturing valuable supplies and equipment. The rebels' actions made it increasingly difficult for Spanish forces to resupply their troops in Santiago de Cuba. This was particularly problematic for the Spanish fleet, which was already under pressure from the U.S. Navy's blockade. The combination of the blockade and the rebels' sabotage efforts created a logistical nightmare for Spanish commanders, who struggled to keep their forces supplied and operational. The rebels' disruption of Spanish logistics also had a broader strategic impact. By cutting off Spanish supply lines, the rebels effectively isolated Santiago de Cuba from the rest of the island. This made it more difficult for Spanish forces to reinforce the city or to coordinate a unified defense. As a result, Spanish commanders were forced to fight a defensive battle with limited resources, which ultimately contributed to their defeat. The broader significance of the Cuban rebels in the struggle for independence. The Cuban rebels' role in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was not just a tactical contribution to a single battle. It was part of a broader struggle for Cuban independence that had been ongoing for years. The rebels' efforts in the Santiago campaign were a continuation of their long-standing fight against Spanish colonial rule, and their contributions to the American victory were a testament to their resilience and determination. The Cuban rebels as a symbol of resistance. The Cuban rebels' role in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was a powerful symbol of resistance against colonial oppression. The rebels had been fighting for their freedom long before the United States entered the conflict, and their efforts demonstrated that the Cuban people were willing to make tremendous sacrifices to achieve independence. The rebels' ability to sustain a guerrilla war against a much larger and better-equipped Spanish army was a testament to their ingenuity, resourcefulness, and determination. Their success in weakening Spanish control over the island and in supporting the American military effort was a clear demonstration of their commitment to the cause of Cuban independence. The Cuban rebels and the legacy of the Spanish-American War. The Cuban rebels' contributions to the Battle of Santiago de Cuba and the broader Spanish-American War had a lasting impact on the legacy of the conflict. While the war is often remembered as a triumph of American military power, the role of the Cuban rebels serves as a reminder that the conflict was also a struggle for national liberation. The Cuban rebels' efforts helped to ensure that the Spanish-American War was not just a conflict between two imperial powers but also a war of independence for the Cuban people. Their contributions to the American victory were a key factor in the eventual achievement of Cuban independence, and their legacy continues to be celebrated in Cuba today. The Cuban rebels and the post-war period. The Cuban rebels' role in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba also had important implications for the post-war period. While the American victory in the Spanish-American War led to the end of Spanish colonial rule in Cuba, it also marked the beginning of a new era of American influence in the region. The Cuban rebels, who had fought for independence from Spain, now found themselves facing a new challenge: navigating the complex relationship between Cuba and the United States. The rebels' contributions to the American victory gave them a degree of leverage in the post-war negotiations, but they also faced significant challenges in asserting their independence in the face of American dominance. The legacy of the Cuban rebels' struggle for independence continues to shape Cuban politics and society to this day, serving as a reminder of the complexities of the relationship between Cuba and the United States. The Cuban rebels played a crucial role in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, contributing to both the land and naval campaigns that led to the defeat of Spanish forces. Their efforts in the Santiago campaign were a continuation of their long-standing struggle for independence, and their contributions to the American victory were a testament to their resilience and determination. The Cuban rebels' role in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was not just a tactical contribution to a single battle. It was part of a broader struggle for Cuban independence that had been ongoing for years. Their efforts in the Santiago campaign were a powerful symbol of resistance against colonial oppression, and their legacy continues to be celebrated in Cuba today. The Cuban rebels' contributions to the American victory in the Spanish-American War had a lasting impact on the legacy of the conflict, serving as a reminder that the war was not just a conflict between two imperial powers but also a war of independence for the Cuban people. Their role in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was a key factor in the eventual achievement of Cuban independence, and their legacy continues to shape Cuban politics and society to this day. In conclusion, the Cuban rebels' role in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was multifaceted and significant. Their contributions to the land and naval campaigns, their impact on Spanish morale and logistics, and their broader significance in the struggle for Cuban independence all underscore the importance of their role in this pivotal engagement. The Cuban rebels were not just passive observers in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. They were active participants who played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the conflict and in securing the future of their nation.